What's more important when it comes to actually achieving financial independence? Doing it as quickly as possible or enjoying the process? If you were given the choice to work a high-paying but also highly stressful job from the age of 23 to the age of 30 and then retire, or working a comparatively lower-paying job but one that has a lot less stress associated with it that you can work at until you're 50 and then retire, which one would you rather do? Both achieve financial independence and even early retirement, but the lifestyles lived along the way can be very different. So whichever path you choose, it's important to first consider the pros and cons of all your options. With that in mind, let's talk about financial independence's lesser-known cousin, slow FI. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a link to the investing platform M1 Finance. Get started investing for free today. So in this video, we'll be discussing the pros and cons of slow financial independence, how it differs from traditional financial independence, as well as some other similar strategies. And then we'll discuss who it might work best for. But for those of you who are new to the financial community, let's quickly go over what traditional financial independence is. Traditional financial independence is defined as a time and place where your assets can reliably cover all of your ongoing expenses, even if you were to retire. The most common way to determine if you're financially independent is to use something known as the 4% rule. The 4% rule is based on something called the Trinity study conducted by Professor William Bengen in 1998. In it, Bengen found that you could reasonably expect your nest egg to last you at least 30 years in retirement, assuming you withdrew no more than 4% of the value of your nest egg in your first year of retirement, with adjustments for inflation every year thereafter. In an earlier video I did on this channel, I examined how safe the 4% rule really is and found very similar results using more updated information. What all this means is that assuming the markets perform roughly as they have over the past 90 to 100 years or so, we can reasonably assume that we are financially independent if we've put away at least 25 times our annual expenses. For someone who spends $40,000 a year, this would mean that they would be considered financially independent if their nest egg was worth $1 million or more. Traditional financial independence is often split into two camps online: those who pursue a form of financial independence known as lean FIRE, and those who aim for something called fat FIRE. Lean FIRE is basically just traditional financial independence with a lifestyle in retirement that requires spending no more than $40,000 a year. Fat FIRE is a little bit more complex. It still uses the 4% rule to gauge its progress, just like traditional financial independence, but it aims to retire on an upper middle class lifestyle. And it's a little more complex because an upper middle class lifestyle in New York City is going to cost a lot more than an upper middle class lifestyle in Mississippi. The general rule of thumb I've seen thrown around most is a $100,000 a year lifestyle in retirement. But again, this does vary from place to place. As you can tell, lean FIRE focuses more on reaching financial independence and possibly retiring early as quickly as possible. And those who follow it are willing to sacrifice some of life's luxuries both on their journey and after achieving their goals. Fat FIRE, on the other hand, aims to earn a pretty healthy living even in retirement, and those aiming for it are willing to spend a little more time on their journey to financial independence in order to gain that lifestyle after their goals are achieved. You'll also notice that the two camps both have that FIRE acronym instead of just FI. For those who don't know, FIRE stands for Financially Independent, Retired Early. That's because many, though certainly not all people who pursue these lifestyles are aiming to leave the workforce early, and sometimes incredibly early. Many retire before the age of 40, and some have even managed it before the age of 30. This is often the result of a couple of things. People who retire that early often worked fairly high-paying jobs, and they were extremely frugal at the same time. It's not uncommon to see people in these groups having savings rates, or the percentage of their pay that they put towards their savings and investments, of 50%, 60%, or even 70% or more. And this is because they know the number one factor determining how fast you can reach financial independence is your savings rate. It's not your income, it's not your rate of return on your investments, although those factors can help out a bit. The most important factor is the amount of money you're investing, and therefore, at the same time, the amount of money that you're not spending. Let's take a look at how this works. Let's say that John and Jane earn $100,000 a year combined. They're both 25 years old and want to retire before they turn 40. Obviously, they're making pretty darn good money, especially for their ages. So they've got that going for them, but if their behaviors don't match up with their goals, it's not going to matter. First, let's assume that they follow the traditional advice for saving and investing for retirement and put away 15% of their income, or in this case $15,000 a year. If we assume that inflation is going to be 3% per year and that John and Jane's wages are able to keep up with that inflation, they will still need to have an average annual rate of return of about 27% per year on their investments to have enough money in their nest egg to be considered financially independent by the time they turn 40. That's 27% returns per year every year for 15 years in a row. Needless to say, that's pretty unrealistic. However, if John and Jane increase their savings rate, we'd see that required annual rate of return drop quite quickly. For example, if John and Jane managed to save 30% of their income instead of 15%, they would only need an average return of about 18% per year, which is still quite unrealistic, but closer to the ballpark of realism than 27% per year. If they managed to save 50% of their income, they'd require returns of about 9% per year. And if they managed to save a whopping 70% of their income, they'd require returns of -2% per year. In other words, their rate of return becomes almost meaningless because they don't actually require any positive returns at all. That's the power of having a high savings rate. The one thing that I'm sure you've noticed is that while saving 50% or 70% of your income may be very doable with a $100,000 a year income, at least if you're not living somewhere that's incredibly expensive and you're taking advantage of all your tax-advantaged accounts, it's not going to be very easy to achieve with a $30,000 or $40,000 a year income. And that's true. It's going to be a lot tougher with the lower levels of income. And you'd have to get pretty creative with your housing and transportation situations at the very least to even have a chance at pulling it off. And that's not something that everyone is willing or able to do, often with good reason. For example, you could, theoretically, couch surf or rent hack in such a way that your housing costs are near enough zero. You could also sell your car and start biking to and from work, and everywhere else to get your transportation costs to near enough zero. You could stop eating out entirely and cook everything at home using food you bought with coupons, or food you got at a community garden, or somewhere similar to slash your food budgets as much as possible. You could stop spending money on anything that isn't a want, and you could switch to the cheapest insurance available to save that last bit of cash. Or just go with no insurance at all, which is not something I would recommend doing. But hypothetically, if you did all that stuff, maybe you'd be able to live on $1,000 a month or even less, which is what you would probably need to do to save 70% of your income on a $40,000 a year salary. The real question is, do you really want to do all that just to reach financial independence a little bit sooner? Is being that stingy with your money really worth it? Or is there a better way? Remember, financial independence, at least in the traditional sense, is based off your expenses once you're independent. If you slash your current expenses, you can save more and reach financial independence sooner. But if you aren't going to continue living that way after becoming financially independent, then your nest egg is going to have to be a bit bigger to remain independent. You also have to consider what you'll be missing out on by living that sort of a lifestyle. Being frugal is one thing, and it's one thing that I applaud, but being stingy is something else entirely. This is where slow FI comes into the equation. Slow FI is something I came across on an article from the Fioneers website, which I'll leave a link to in the description below if you want to check out the full thing for yourself. They define slow FI as someone utilizing the incremental financial freedom they gain along the journey to full financial independence to live a happier and healthier life, to do better work, and to build strong relationships. Ultimately, the end goal is still to achieve full financial independence, but it emphasizes the time it takes to get there less than the enjoyment of the journey itself. This strategy towards achieving financial independence can take on many forms, from someone leaving their high-paying but highly stressful job to take a lower-paying but more enjoyable job, or someone starting a side hustle, or working part-time and negotiating a remote working agreement so that they can travel the world while still being employed. The pros and cons to this path to financial independence are fairly straightforward. Obviously, it will take longer, in most cases, to reach true financial independence than the other methods of lean fire or fat fire might. The plus side is that it's much less likely that you will be depriving yourself of critical or just enjoyable life experiences along the way. After all, we only get one life to live. And the differences in time it takes to achieve financial independence doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly large, depending on your situation. Let's look back at John and Jane's example from before. They make $100,000 a year and are 25 years old. We saw that they could retire by the age of 40 if they saved 50% of their income and earned an average return of about 9% per year. This is a little higher than my usual conservative estimates, but it is in the ballpark of what many index funds have achieved historically, including Vanguard's S&P 500 index fund, which earned about 10.5% per year since January of 1980, assuming you reinvested all the dividends. But if instead of investing that 50% of their income, they invested 30% and received that 9% return, they would be fully financially independent in 25 years at the age of 50. The difference is they would have been able to enjoy the lifestyle an additional $20,000 a year of spending money would grant them over those years. If they enjoyed the work that they did, they could elect to retire even after the age of 50. Say if they decided they wanted to retire at 60, they would only need to save about 17% of their income for retirement. Another thing to keep in mind when comparing these two strategies is that John and Jane's initial strategy of saving 50% of their income made them financially independent at the age of 40, assuming they lived on $50,000 a year in retirement. John and Jane's slow FI strategy made them financially independent at the age of 50, but with a $70,000 a year income in retirement. If they pushed their retirement date out to the age of 60, they would have had a lifestyle of $83,000 a year after they hung up their boots for good. So if John and Jane wanted to match the post-financial independence lifestyle of their slow FI counterparts, they would have to have saved 50% of their income for either 18 years and 9 months or 20 years and 9 months, depending on whether they were trying to achieve a $70,000 lifestyle in retirement or an $83,000 a year lifestyle in retirement. That would mean that John and Jane are becoming financially independent shortly before turning 44 in the $70,000 a year scenario, or shortly before turning 46 in the $83,000 a year scenario. So as you can see, there still certainly is a difference between the two, but considering the difference in lifestyle pre-financial independence, for some of us, it may not be that big of a sacrifice to make. Which makes it seem to me that this strategy would work particularly well for those who can see themselves working in some capacity for a fairly normal amount of years, and who don't want to, or can't, find a reasonable and sustainable way to maintain those crazy high savings rates that are often required to reach financial independence and retire very, very early. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.